I still remember the exact temperature of the air in my father's study the night everything fell apart between us. It was November, one of those bitter, early winter nights in downtown Chicago where the wind off Lake Michigan doesn't just chill you, it cuts straight through you, like the city itself is trying to remind you how small you are. The study was warm, though, obscenely warm. My father, Richard Cole, kept it at 78 degrees year-round. He said cold offices made for soft decisions. That was the kind of man he was. Every detail of his environment was engineered to project dominance. The room smelled like aged leather and the particular brand of imported scotch he kept on the mahogany sideboard, the bottle with the gold label that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The walls were lined with framed magazine covers, Forbes, Inc., The Wall Street Journal. Richard Cole's face stared back from almost every one of them, jaw set, eyes cold, the look of a man who had decided long ago that the world owed him reverence and was simply collecting what was due. I was 22 years old that night, and I had just told him I was enlisting in the United States Army. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. He didn't look up from his desk immediately. He was reviewing documents. He was always reviewing documents, and he took his time setting down his pen, aligning it perfectly parallel to the folder's edge. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't rage. It wasn't even disappointment. It was something colder than both of those things. It was dismissal. "You're serious," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." He leaned back in his chair, that enormous, high-backed leather throne that I used to spin in as a child when he wasn't around, and he studied me the way he studied quarterly earnings, searching for the weakness, the flaw in the numbers. "Ethan," he said, "I have spent 22 years building something that will outlast me. Cole Industries isn't just a company, it's a legacy, your legacy. And you want to throw that away to play soldier." "I don't want to play soldier, Dad. I want to serve. There's a difference." He made a sound in the back of his throat, dismissive, dry, the sound he made in meetings when a junior associate said something naive. "Service." He tasted the word like it was something foreign. "Ethan, men in our position don't serve. We lead, we build. We don't hand our bodies over to the government and come back in a box." "Or we come back stronger," I said. "Grandpa Joe served. You've never once said a word against him for it."
That landed. I saw it, a flicker behind his eyes. My grandfather, Joseph Cole, was the one person on earth my father could not easily dismiss. The man had built the original family fortune from nothing with his hands and his wit and his extraordinary patience. But even the mention of Grandpa Joe wasn't enough. My father smoothed his expression like a man pulling a curtain. "Your grandfather lived in different times," Richard said. "This conversation is over. You'll report to the office Monday morning, begin your orientation with the acquisitions team, and we'll never speak of this again." I remembered the feeling in my chest in that moment. It was like standing at the edge of a very high cliff and feeling the wind at your back. Terrifying. Inevitable. "I've already signed the papers, Dad." Another silence, longer this time. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I almost had to lean forward to hear him. That was how I knew it was serious. Richard Cole only got quiet when he was done pretending there was any warmth left. "Then you understand what this means," he said. "You walk out that door as a soldier. You don't walk back in as my son. You have made your choice. Live with it." My mother, Margaret, was waiting in the hallway. She had obviously been listening. She was a beautiful woman, tall, elegant, always dressed as though she might be photographed, and she had the particular talent of wealthy women who marry powerful men. She had learned to make her feelings invisible. She looked at me with something complicated in her eyes, something that might have been love fighting a losing battle against loyalty, and she said nothing, just pressed her lips together and looked away. My younger brother, Daniel, was 18 and already interning at coal industries. He was leaning against the banister at the top of the stairs, watching me come out of the study. He smiled, not a warm smile, a satisfied one. Daniel had been waiting his whole life for me to step aside. "Good luck, soldier," he said. I didn't respond. I picked up the duffel bag I had already packed, walked through the marble foyer of the house I had grown up in, pushed open the heavy front door, and stepped out into the Chicago cold. I was terrified. I was heartbroken, and I was, beneath all of that, deeply, stubbornly proud. I won't fill this story with the details of my service, because that's not what this story is about. What I will tell you is this: the Army made me into something I couldn't have become in any boardroom. I learned discipline that wasn't bought. I earned respect that wasn't inherited. I met men and women from every corner of this country, from the Mississippi Delta and the mountains of West Virginia and the flatlands of Kansas, and I understood for the first time what it meant to be part of something bigger than a family name. I served 2 deployments. I was good at what I did. And then, on a morning that looked like every other morning, everything changed. I won't dwell on the details. The doctors called it a significant lower extremity injury compounded by secondary trauma. What that means in plain language is that I came home a different man in a damaged body. My left leg never fully healed the way the surgeons hoped. I had a long road of rehabilitation ahead of me and scars that would tell the story whether I wanted them to or not. I was 26 years old, walking with crutches, and for the first time in my life, I was genuinely unsure whether I had the strength to keep going. But I was alive, and I thought, foolishly, desperately, in the way that only a wounded person thinks, that maybe going home would help.
The Cole family home in the North Shore suburbs of Chicago is the kind of house that doesn't look real from the street. 8,000 square feet of stone and glass and imported slate roofing, set behind an iron gate with an intercom in a circular driveway where the cars parked out front cost more than most homes. I had grown up inside those walls. I had learned to ride a bike in that driveway. I had watched every Christmas morning sunrise from the window at the top of the east staircase. I stood at the gate on a gray Tuesday morning in late October, crutches under my arms, a military-issued duffel on my back, and I pressed the intercom button. There was a pause long enough to make my stomach drop. Then my mother's voice, "Ethan." Not Ethan, not the sound of relief or joy or the desperate love of a mother who has spent months praying for her son to come home safely, just Ethan, flat and careful, like she was confirming an appointment. "Hi, Mom," I said. "I'm home." The gate clicked open. I made my way up the driveway slowly. The crutches were still awkward for me then. I hadn't had them long enough to feel natural, and the stone pavers were uneven in places. I focused on each step. I did not let myself think too far ahead. The front door opened before I reached it. My mother stood in the frame, wearing a cream-colored blouse and pressed trousers, her hair done perfectly, her expression arranged into something carefully neutral. She looked at my crutches. She looked at my leg. She looked at my face, the exhaustion written there, the weight behind my eyes. And something crossed her expression so quickly I almost missed it, something that might have been grief. Then it was gone. She stepped back to let me in, but she did not hug me. The house was exactly as I remembered it. The enormous vaulted foyer with the oil paintings, the staircase curving up to the second floor, the smell of fresh flowers arranged by a professional decorator who came every Monday. Nothing had changed, and somehow that made it worse. I had been to war and come back altered at the molecular level, and here the flower arrangement was identical to how it had always been. "Your father is in the study," my mother said. "He'd like to speak with you." I noticed she said, "Your father would like to speak with you," not, "We're so glad you're home." I filed that away in the part of my brain that was already bracing for impact. Daniel was in the living room, on a leather couch, laptop open, phone in hand. He looked up when I passed the doorway. He was 22 now, taller than I remembered, wearing a suit jacket over a casual shirt, the coal industry's uniform for young executives who wanted to look both powerful and approachable. He looked at my crutches the way people look at car accidents, that mixture of fascination and discomfort. "Ethan," he said, "you look rough." "Good to see you too, Daniel." I didn't stop walking.
The study door was open. My father was behind his desk. He was 61 years old, and he looked exactly like power was supposed to look, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed. He watched me cross the room toward the chair across from his, and he watched me lower myself into it with the specific difficulty of a man whose body is still learning its new limitations. He watched all of that without offering any help and without changing his expression. "Ethan," he said. "Dad, how long are the doctors saying for the rehabilitation? Not, how are you? Not, I'm glad you're alive. Just the rehabilitation timeline, the logistics. 18 months minimum, maybe longer depending on how things progress." He nodded slowly, as though I had presented him with an unfavorable market analysis. "And your capacity to work during that period." I stared at him. "Dad, I just got home."
I understand that, but I need to understand our situation clearly, Ethan, and I think you do too. He folded his hands on the desk. "You left this family 4 years ago, against my explicit wishes. You made your choices, and I respected your right to make them, even when I disagreed. But now you've come back, and I have to be direct with you, because I don't know any other way to be." He paused. "You are not the same person who can step into the role I originally envisioned for you. Your condition," "My condition," I repeated quietly, "makes you a liability in the environment of coal industries. The board would see it. Our partners would see it. I cannot afford to introduce instability into a company that—" "I'm your son." The word fell between us like something heavy dropped on marble. It echoed. My father looked at me for a long moment, and I want to tell you that I saw remorse there. I want to tell you that somewhere behind those cold, calculating eyes, a father's heart broke open. But the truth is, I didn't see that. I saw a man who had made his decision long before I walked through the door and was now simply delivering the verdict. "You chose your path," he said. "You chose it over this family's path. I told you the consequences. I meant what I said." My mother appeared in the doorway. She didn't speak. She just stood there, and her silence was its own kind of answer. "There is a property," my father continued, "your grandfather's farm, in Western Virginia, outside a town called Millhaven. It's been sitting empty for years. I've been meaning to deal with it. The property taxes alone are—" He waved a hand. "There's a key." He slid a small, rust-spotted key across the desk toward me. "The house is livable as far as I know. You can stay there while you figure out your next steps." I looked at the key. Old iron, slightly orange with rust, the kind of key that belongs to another era entirely. "I'm getting sent to a farm?" I said. "I'm giving you a place to land, which is more than you've given this family." I picked up the key. I looked at my father one more time, at his silver hair, his tailored suit, his framed magazine covers, his entire carefully constructed world, and I stood up. Getting up from a chair still took effort then. I used the armrest, found my crutches, squared my shoulders. "Thank you for your generosity." The words tasted like ash. He nodded once. Business concluded. I walked out of the study. I walked through the foyer. I walked past my mother, who reached out and briefly touched my arm, just for a second, just the lightest brush of her hand, and then pulled back as if she'd thought better of it. I walked down the driveway, through the gate, into the October cold, and I did not look back.
The drive to Millhaven, Virginia took 8 hours. I had used the last of my mustering out pay to rent a car, an economy sedan with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked on only 2 of its 4 settings. I drove through the mountains of Western Virginia as the sun went down, watching the Blue Ridge dissolve into a purple dusk, the highway narrowing from 4 lanes to 2 to barely 1.5, flanked by old-growth oak and hickory that arched overhead like a cathedral built by the land itself. Millhaven was a town of maybe 1,200 people, a gas station, a diner, a dollar store, a small white church with a hand-painted sign out front, the kind of place that American news never covered unless something went wrong, the kind of place that the Richard Coles of the world flew over and never thought about. I found the farm on the 3rd try. The road wasn't on any GPS map. It was a dirt track, overgrown on both sides, that turned off the county road between a rusted mailbox and an old fence post wound with wild blackberry vines. The headlights swept across a long, low farmhouse as I pulled up. White clapboard paint gone gray with age, a porch that sagged in the middle, window shutters hanging at uneven angles. The land around it, maybe 40 acres from what I could see in the dark, was a tangle of tall grass and wildflower that had been growing undisturbed for years. The fields beyond the house were invisible in the darkness, just a vast, soft, breathing presence. The only sound was the wind and the distant sound of what might have been a creek. I sat in the car for a long time before I got out. I want to be honest with you here, because this is not the part of the story that feels good to tell, but it's the part that matters most. I was at the lowest point of my life, not the lowest point of a bad week or a hard year, the lowest point. I was 26 years old, physically broken, sleeping in a rent car outside an abandoned farmhouse, with an iron key in my pocket, no money, no plan, and a family that had looked me in the eye and told me I was worth less than the liability I represented on their balance sheet. The men I had served with were scattered across the country. The life I had built in the army was over, and the life I'd been born into had been revoked. I sat in that car, and I thought, is this it? Is this everything? I don't want to dress up what I felt in that moment with comfortable language. I will just tell you that I sat with a darkness that night that I have never told anyone the full shape of. A darkness that whispered that everything was already finished, that the ending had already been written, that there was no version of this story worth continuing. But here is what happened. I got out of the car. I don't know exactly why. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the thin, unreasonable hope that if I just got through this one night, morning would bring something I couldn't yet see. Maybe it was the memory of Grandpa Joe's voice, low and warm and unhurried, telling me once when I was about 8 years old and had skinned my knee pretty badly. Ethan boy, pain means you're still in the game. It's the absence of feeling you've got to worry about. I got out of the car. I found the rusted lock on the front door. The key turned hard, resisting, and then, with a deep grinding click, the door swung open. The farmhouse smelled of old wood and dried herbs and dust and thyme. I found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer on the second try, the batteries weak but functional. I moved through the rooms slowly, taking stock. A kitchen, a sitting room with a stone fireplace, 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub. It was dusty but structurally sound. There was even a stack of split firewood on the covered side porch. My grandfather had been a thorough man.
I built a fire that night. I sat on the floor in front of it, my back against the old sofa, and I let myself feel everything. The grief, the rage, the loss. I let it move through me like weather. And in the morning, I walked out to find the barn. It was set back from the house, maybe 60 yards, at the edge of where the mowed yard gave way to the wild meadow. A big old structure, bigger than I expected, with a gambrel roof and wide double doors held shut by a board and latch mechanism. The wood was silvery gray with age, but the frame was still true, solid. The kind of barn that was built to last generations by a man who thought in generations. I lifted the latch. The doors swung outward with a long, low groan, and I heard it. A sound like nothing I can fully describe to someone who hasn't heard it. A deep, resonant, living hum. Not threatening, not mechanical. Something older and more organic than either of those things. The sound of 10,000 small lives going about their ancient, purposeful business. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the gaps in the old siding. The left wall of the barn was lined with beehives, long Langstroth boxes stacked in towers, maybe 30 hives in all, painted white and pale blue, worn with years, but clearly tended with care at some point before they were left. And around them, through them, of them, bees. More bees than I had ever seen outside of a wildlife documentary. They moved in slow, golden rivers through the morning light that slanted through the gaps in the barn wall, each shaft of light alive with the glitter of wings. And the color of them was unusual. I didn't know enough about bees then to understand what I was seeing, but I know now. These were no ordinary honeybee. They were larger than standard Italian or Carniolan bees, with a deeper, more burnished gold to their abdomens, and their movement was distinctly calmer, unhurried. They moved the way the farm itself seemed to breathe, slowly, with purpose, as though they had all the time in the world. I should have been afraid. A man who doesn't know bees walking into a barn full of them, with no protective gear, no suit, no veil. The sensible thing would have been to back out immediately. I didn't back out. I don't know why. I just stood there, leaning on my crutches, watching them. And then something happened that I have never been fully able to explain and have stopped trying to. A cluster of bees, maybe 50, maybe 100, drifted away from the nearest hive and floated toward me. They landed, gently, on my hands, on the backs of my hands and the knuckles of the exposed skin of my wrists where my sleeves had written up, the places that the doctors at the rehab facility had pointed out nerve damage, the places that had not felt much of anything for weeks. They didn't sting me. They just sat there, vibrating softly. Warm. Bees are surprisingly warm, like tiny living embers. I felt a tingling in my hands that the neurologists would tell me later was likely just circulation and nerve response. But in that barn, in that moment, standing in that golden morning light with my family's rejection still raw and the darkness of the night before still close, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like being recognized, like being told, "You belong here. You're not done." I started crying, standing in a ruined old barn on an abandoned farm in Western Virginia with bees on my hands. I cried until there was nothing left. And then I found the journals. On a workbench at the back of the barn, beneath a canvas tarp, there were 8 leather-bound journals, each one filled with my grandfather's careful, sloping handwriting. The earliest was dated 1962, the most recent, 1999, just 3 years before he died. I carried them back to the house, and I began to read.
Grandpa Joe had spent 40 years learning the bees, not just keeping them, learning them. The journals were unlike anything I had ever read, part science, part philosophy, part love letter to a piece of land and the wild creatures that inhabited it. He had discovered his unusual golden bee strain in the mid-1960s, a natural hybrid that had developed in the wild meadows of the Western Virginia Valley, and he had spent decades observing, cultivating, and protecting them. He wrote about their unusual temperament, their extraordinary productivity, their apparent preference for the native wildflowers, ironweed, goldenrod, mountain mint, wild bergamot that grew in the meadow behind the barn. And he wrote about the honey. He described it as unlike any honey he had encountered in 50 years of beekeeping, darker than standard wildflower honey, with a taste he struggled to put words to. Complex, he wrote, the way a piece of land can be complex, carrying the memory of everything that's grown on it. He noted its unusual medicinal properties with the careful, empirical eye of a man who didn't make claims lightly. Lower inflammation in his arthritic hands within 2 weeks of daily consumption, better sleep, clearer thinking. He cited a visiting beekeeper from Maryland who had brought a sample to a university lab and whose informal tests had revealed an unusually high concentration of antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds,
far outside the normal range. "This honey is something," he wrote in the last journal, in the shaky handwriting of an old man. "I don't know exactly what it is or why the valley makes it this way, but I know it's real. I know what I felt. I hope whoever comes after me has the sense to listen to the bees." I started working the hives on the third day. I had never done it before. I went slowly, reading the journals, watching tutorials on my phone in the evenings when the farmhouse Wi-Fi, weak, spotty, barely functional, would cooperate. And I made mistakes. I moved too quickly and agitated a hive. I once dropped a frame that cost me a week's worth of comb. But the bees, those calm, amber-colored bees, were patient with me in a way I had not expected. They never became aggressive. They hummed their deep, resonant hum and went about their work. And slowly, over weeks, I began to understand their rhythms, when to open a hive and when to leave it, how to read the tone of their buzzing like a language, when they were calm, when they were unsettled, when something was wrong. I started eating the honey in October, just a spoonful each morning, the way Grandpa Joe had described. The taste hit me like something I'd been looking for my whole life without knowing it. Rich and complex and entirely unlike anything store-bought, with a warmth that settled in my chest and radiated outward. By December, my hands had regained feeling in 2 fingers that had been largely numb for months. My physical therapist, I was driving to the next county town twice a week, was surprised enough to adjust his notes. By February, I had retired one of the crutches. By April, I was walking with just a cane. The doctors had no certain explanation. They used words like atypical recovery trajectory and possible neurological regeneration. I didn't argue with their language. I just kept eating the honey. That spring, I borrowed against the land's deed, a small loan from a regional bank, whose loan officer, a patient woman named Mrs. Garfield, looked at my business plan with skeptical kindness and said, "I hope you know what you're going to do with 40 acres and a barn full of bees." And I began to scale. I expanded the apiary, added 20 new hives, sourcing queens from my existing healthy stock. I cultivated the meadow, planted additional acres of native wildflowers to feed the bees through the full season. I built a proper extraction facility in a second barn I fixed up myself over the course of a spring that I worked through with a ferocity I had not felt since my army days. Physical work, real and demanding, was its own kind of medicine.
I called the honey Golden Millhaven Raw. I started with 3 dozen jars, labeled by hand, and brought them to the Saturday farmers market in the county seat. The first Saturday, I sold out in 40 minutes. Word spreads fast in small communities. By the third Saturday, people were driving from 2 counties over. By summer, a food blogger from Charlottesville had come specifically to find my stand and posted a review that described the honey as transcendent and unlike any wildflower honey I've tasted in 20 years of writing about food. The post went semi-viral over a weekend. I sold 300 jars in 4 days through a hastily built website. I ran out of inventory in a week. That fall, I hired my first 2 employees, brothers from Millhaven named Marcus and Cole, who were out of work since the lumber mill downsized. I expanded the apiary again. By the following spring, I had 80 hives. By that summer, I had 120. A wellness brand from Austin reached out first, a premium organic health company that wanted to feature Golden Millhaven Raw in their subscription boxes. Then a natural grocery chain from the Pacific Northwest. Then a nutrition researcher from the University of Virginia who had seen the early social media noise and wanted to conduct a formal study on the honey's anti-inflammatory properties. The study's results were published 18 months later. The findings were significant enough to generate attention from the scientific community and the mainstream health press simultaneously. The New York Times Wellness section ran a piece titled "The Honey from a Virginia Holler That Researchers Can't Quite Explain." Within 48 hours of that article's publication, my website received 2 million visits. I sat in my grandfather's farmhouse, which I had by then fully restored, new floors and new windows, and a kitchen that finally worked properly, and looked at the server crash notification on my laptop, and I called Mrs. Garfield at the bank. "I think," I said, "I'm going to need a bigger loan."
She laughed. "Ethan Cole," she said, "I think you might need an investor." She introduced me to a man named Franklin Webb, a green tech and organic food investor out of San Francisco who had been circling the artisanal honey space for years and had been watching Golden Millhaven Raw's growth with something close to awe. He flew into Charlottesville, drove to Millhaven, put on a veil, and stood in the meadow while I walked him through the operation. "This is the most extraordinary thing I've seen in 15 years of this work," he said, watching the golden bees move through the bergamot. "What do you need?" "Everything," I said. "I need everything." We closed a Series A round of funding that valued the company at $40 million. Then a Series B, 18 months after that, at $300 million. I brought in operations experts, supply chain specialists, a world-class head of R&D who built a lab right there in Western Virginia to study the honey's properties and develop new product lines. I acquired neighboring farms and expanded the meadow to nearly 400 acres. The product lines grew: raw honey, beeswax products, probiotic honey supplements, topical anti-inflammatory treatments co-developed with the UVA research team. We opened a flagship experience center in Millhaven, a beautiful timber and glass building that drew visitors from across the country to tour the apiary, learn about the bees, and buy directly from the source. The town itself transformed. New restaurants, a small hotel, artisan shops. The population quietly grew for the first time in 30 years. I was 33 years old when the company hit a $1 billion valuation. I was standing in the meadow at dawn when my CFO called to tell me, surrounded by 400 acres of ironweed and goldenrod and the ancient, unhurried sound of 10,000 bees going about their work. The same bees. Grandpa Joe's bees. My bees. I put the phone in my pocket. I stood there in the morning light. I thought about a night 5 years earlier, sitting on a farmhouse floor in the dark, with nothing. And I said out loud, to no one and to everything, "Thank you, Grandpa."
I did not seek out what happened next. I want to be clear about that. I had not spent one day of those 5 years thinking about revenge or waiting for my family's downfall. The farm, the bees, the work, they had healed something in me that went deeper than my leg. I had built something real, something I was proud of. Something that had given 40 families in Western Virginia good employment, and given the world something genuinely valuable. I had done it without my father's money, without his name, without his blessing. I didn't need anything else from Richard Cole. But the financial world is not sentimental, and it does not make exceptions for powerful men. I heard it first from a former Army buddy who had gone into finance. A brief text message. "Ethan, you should look at the Cole Industries news this week." I looked. The story had been building for years, apparently, in the pages of financial publications that I no longer followed. Cole Industries had made a series of catastrophic investments in the early 2020s, overextended into a commercial real estate portfolio that collapsed, then doubled down into a tech sector that imploded the following year. My father's particular brand of aggressive, top-down leadership had, according to every analyst quoted, bred an executive culture where no one was willing to tell the emperor he had no clothes. Bad decision piled on bad decision. Debt mounted. Investors fled. By the time I was reading about it, Cole Industries was effectively insolvent. The board had ousted my father in a vote that, from the descriptions, had not been gentle. Daniel, who had been installed as a vice president at 28, had apparently made the situation considerably worse with a series of acquisitions that made my father's errors look conservative. The company's debt portfolio, substantial, complex, distributed across multiple creditors, had been packaged and quietly put up for sale. My acquisition team brought it to me on a Wednesday morning. I sat with the documents for a long time. I thought about what Grandpa Joe would have said. I thought about the kind of man I wanted to be. I thought about the difference between justice and cruelty, and the thin, important line between them. Then I made the call.
We acquired coal industry's entire debt portfolio on a Friday, through 3 layers of holding companies that did not, anywhere in their documentation, bear my name. The transaction settled over a weekend, and on Monday morning, the Cole family received formal notice that their debts had been consolidated under a single new creditor who was calling in the terms. The request to meet was made by my mother. She called the number on the notice letter and reached my CFO, and she asked, in the carefully controlled voice of a woman who had practiced not showing her feelings for 40 years, if it would be possible to arrange a meeting with the company's ownership. My CFO said she would check. She checked, and she scheduled the meeting. The Golden Millhaven headquarters was by then a showpiece. The main building, designed by an architect I had given simple instructions to, make it look like it grew here, was a long, low structure of reclaimed timber and locally quarried stone, set into the edge of the meadow with a full wall of glass facing the apiary. In the morning, when the light was right, you could sit in the conference room and watch the golden bees moving against the fields of wildflowers like living sparks.
I was in my office when they arrived. My assistant told me, 3 of them, my father, my mother, my brother. I looked out my window at the meadow for a moment. I took a breath, and I went to meet them. I opened the conference room door myself. I didn't send a subordinate, didn't make them wait any longer than necessary. I walked through the door, walked, not limped, not hobbled, walked, in a suit that was not expensive in the way my father's suits were expensive, but was well made and fit well and suited the man I had become. My cane was gone. The scars on my hands were still there, faint and silver, but my hands were steady and strong. I watched their faces as they processed what they were seeing. My mother brought her hand to her mouth. My brother's jaw slackened. He looked at my hands, my posture, the case he had built in his head over the years about who and what his wounded, discarded older brother must have become, and he watched it dismantle in real time. My father looked at me the way I imagine a man looks when the ground beneath a certainty finally gives way. He was older. The silver hair had gone white. He looked smaller than I remembered, and I understood for the first time that he had always been smaller than I remembered. The desk and the study and the imported scotch had been a kind of architecture around a man who needed architecture to look like more than he was. "Ethan," he said. "Richard," I said. Not Dad, just his name. I sat down across from them. I poured 3 glasses of water, plain water, from a pitcher on the table because I was no longer performing anything for anyone, and I pushed the glasses toward them. "I know why you're here," I said. My father straightened in his chair. Even now, even in this, the instinct for control was still there. "Then you understand that we're asking—" "I understand what you're asking," I said quietly. "You want me to restructure the debt in terms that will allow your remaining assets to survive. You want to keep the house, most likely, and what's left of the operating businesses. You want a lifeline."
A silence. "Yes," my mother said. Her voice was almost a whisper. "Yes, Ethan, that's what we're asking." She reached across the table toward my hand. I didn't move my hand away, but I didn't reach toward her either. "Mom," I said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly." I waited until she met my eyes. "I'm not angry. I want you to know that. I genuinely am not angry. Carrying that much anger for 5 years would have cost me everything I built, and what I built is worth more to me than any feeling of score settling. I forgave you a long time ago, in my own heart, for my own sake, not for yours." I looked at my father. "You told me the day I came home that I was a liability. You gave me a rusted key and the clothes on my back and sent me to a farm that you'd forgotten existed. I want to tell you what I found there." I told them, not all of it, not the dark night, the despair, the bees on my hands in the dawn, but the substance of it, the journals, the honey, the meadow, the work. I told it plainly, without triumph or bitterness, because the story itself was enough. When I finished, my father was very still. Daniel was staring at the table. "The company you built," he said slowly, "the valuation is real," I said, "and it will continue to grow, and it will outlast Coal Industries, which is no longer truly a company so much as a collection of obligations." He nodded once, a short, tight nod. "So," he said, "what are the terms?" I looked at each of them in turn. My father, who had built an empire on the premise that love was a transaction and family was a holding company. My mother, who had chosen the transaction every time. My brother, who had smiled from the top of the staircase the night I walked out. "The terms," I said, "are these. The debt stands. I'm not here to destroy you. That was never the point, and it's still not. But I will also not rescue you. You will negotiate with my legal team the same way any creditor would, on standard terms, with no special consideration for the family relationship, because you made it clear a long time ago that the family relationship had a price, and I was apparently not worth it." I stood up. "I will tell you," I said, "that I think Grandpa Joe would have handled this more generously than I'm handling it. He was a better man than either of us, honestly, and I think about him every single day out there in those meadows. I think about what he tried to tell us about patience and roots and the kind of value that can't be calculated on a spreadsheet." I paused. "You should have listened to him." I moved toward the door. "Ethan," my father said from behind me. Something in his voice I had not heard before, something unguarded. I made mistakes." I stopped at the door. I didn't turn around immediately. I looked out through the glass wall at the meadow, at the golden bees moving through the morning light, at 400 acres of wildflowers, at the land that had given me back my life when my family had taken everything else. "Yes," I said, finally, without turning. "You did." I opened the door. "My team will be in touch Monday morning." And I walked out.
I want to end this the way it began, with honesty. People hear this story now and they want it to be a revenge story. They want the satisfying crash of the gavel, the villain brought low, the hero standing over the wreckage with fire in his eyes. I understand that. We're wired for that kind of ending. But the truth is that the moment I felt truly victorious had nothing to do with my family walking into my conference room. It happened years earlier, on a cold November morning, when I walked out into the meadow just after dawn and stood among the hives and felt the hum of all those golden lives moving through the air around me and realized that I was healed. Not just my leg, not just my hands, healed in the place that had been darkest, in the place that had whispered on that first terrible night that the story was already finished. It wasn't finished. It was barely beginning. Grandpa Joe knew something that Richard Cole never figured out, that the most valuable things in this world don't grow in boardrooms. They grow in patient, quiet places. They grow in meadows. They grow in the long, slow work of learning and failing and staying anyway. They grow in the hands of people who are willing to be still enough to listen. The bees taught me that. 40 acres of wildflowers and 10,000 patient golden creatures who chose me not because of my mane or my net worth or my connections, but because I showed up broken and stayed. I think about that sometimes when I'm out in the meadow at sunrise, the way they chose me. And I think I chose them back. That's the whole story. That's the only story that ever mattered.